Let's start with the most frequently asked questions, and we have a lot that we could cover here, but we'll narrow it down to only 3. The first of which is the optimal squat stance that somebody can use. And what a lot of people do is they ask this question in a way to where it's somewhat inherently wrong, because they usually ask more specifically, what's the best squat stance, right? They don't say for them, they just say the best squat stance. And realistically, that's an inherently flawed question because there is no best squat stance that somebody can use. It's individual to you. And unfortunately, this is the case with many different topics around the industry that we work within. Unfortunately, it'd be so much fun, so much easier if I can just give you X, Y, Z, one specific answer, but unfortunately that's not the case. So understand that the squat stance that's best for you is going to be different than the best squat stance for me. In fact, we go and do seminars where we have 20 different people, we have them squat in a variety of different stances, and what you'll find is 20 completely different squats with 20 completely different degrees of hip flexion needed, pelvic position needed, so on and so forth. So what we have most people do is understand that it's a trial and error process. We'll have most people just start with about a shoulder width stance, little toes pointed out right about here, and then just see how that feels. Somewhere around a little wider than shoulder width, toes pointed slightly out. This is the most common or average stance that's good for the individual, but there's no guarantee it's the best for you. So usually we have people start here, do a few reps, look at pelvic positioning, look at their ability to handle load, look at the range of motion, and determine how comfortable they are in this stance, and then widen it out a little bit, make it a little bit more narrow, try different toe angles. Again, it's a trial and error process that you just have to mess around with, and the determining factors is going to be pelvic position, the range of motion you can go within, what you feel like you can load best, and the comfortability. Again, bit of trial and error, but once you find it, understand that's going to be individual for you. Now, the second frequently asked question is high bar versus low bar. This is the number one question that so many people have, and the fact of the matter is it's kind of a false dichotomy because there is no high bar, low bar, only 2 options. There's a lot in between, so much in between, in fact. But just kind of taking it from that perspective, what's the best? Again, this is another question that cannot be answered with a specific answer. Instead, it's going to be individual to you, but do understand that if we look at a competitive powerlifting environment, I would argue around 90-ish% of people are technically going to have a better loading potential and a low bar squat position. Now, does that mean that's inherently the case for you? No, absolutely not. Some of the best squatters of all time have a higher bar position, but understand that the differences between low bar and high bar, while not that huge, they are there. So for example, high bar is going to be a little bit more upright. It's going to have less degrees of hip flexion. It's going to stimulate the anterior chain a little bit more, and then low bar is complete opposite. Low bar is a lot more hinging, a lot more posterior chain stimulation, a little bit higher degree of trunk stability to maintain spine neutrality. Then lastly, there's going to be a much higher demand of shoulder mobility, which is a really important thing to understand. There's a lot of athletes, a lot of lifters, a lot of people in general that can't withstand the extreme amount of external rotation and flexion, shoulder mobility that's associated with a back squat in general, but especially a low bar back squat, as it amplifies those demands. And if you're somebody like myself, speaking to the choir here, if you're somebody that has limited shoulder mobility, it can put a lot of strain on the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, the forearm, and actually a lot of injuries start this way. So those are the primary differences between the two. Also understand that just because you perform better in one doesn't mean you shouldn't do the other. In fact, one of my favorite squat variations for strengths for a low bar squatter is the high bar. There's a variety of different reasons why somebody would include it. Now, the last frequently asked question that I want to talk about here is going to be bar grip width. This is another very common one, and understand there's certainly such a thing as too narrow as well as too wide, neither one of which we want to push to any high degree. Instead, what we should do is probably start with about a thumb's width from the start of the knurl sort of position, see how that feels, and then work it in and out from there. Because realistically, if we go too far out, our ability to create meaningful upper back rigidity and lat engagement goes out the window. If we go too narrow, Connor, how about you show them too narrow, what that typically looks like? Now, on top of being horrendously painful, oftentimes what you'll see is elbows get flared out, thoracic spine is flexed, head positions forward, and it looks something like this. And if Connor was to try to engage his lats to press his scapula, it's not the prettiest sight in the world. Get out of that ugly ass position. Beautiful. So as you can see here, going too narrow can jack up your position to a point where you no longer have the ability to fully stabilize here. So find that middle ground, find a position where you can create meaningful lat engagement but still maintain solid position. So those are the 3 frequently asked questions. Let's move on to performance points, starting off with the setup. We'll mainly cover 2 things here. The first of which is the setup that we're going to show you and bias you towards, as well as the cadence of cues and the way you should think about a cadence of cues to execute your lifts with the highest ability to handle load and highest ability to stay safe as you do so. So first thing I'm going to cover is the setup, the step-by-step process we're going to show you to optimize it. So Connor's going to go ahead and go through this here starting now. The first thing he's going to do is just grab the bar, but as he does so, like a kid crossing the street, he's going to grab it and then look right, look left, look right, look left. 2 times a piece. This is rather important. Even being a little off center can cause a lot of detriment. So once he knows that the bar is even on the rack and his grip is even on the bar, he can actually set his feet. Now, we're not going to get under quite yet specifically because it's oftentimes hard for somebody to get under the barbell and then kind of guess where their feet should be. So a really good hack to doing so is putting your feet directly under the barbell and then looking at it from the top down, because our goal is to get that barbell to centrate right in the middle of the foot. If our foot is too far back, that causes issues. Too far forward, that also causes issues, both of which we'll talk about more in the common faults section of this presentation. So once he knows his foot is set, I can look at it from the side and see it's directly over the top. He can get under the actual bar. Now, as he gets under the bar, he is not going to go through any positional deviations. This is very common where when somebody gets under the barbell, they'll jack themselves into extension, or they start flexing, get their elbows pitched out. They ruin their position prior to even unracking, which is a major issue. So once he's set here, he's going to make sure that he's neutral, that he's in a position in which he can brace, breathe, engage his lats, and do everything well from. So once he's here, he's going to go through his cadence of stability. So he's going to brace, breathe, brace his trunk. He's going to engage his lats, make sure his head is packed and tall, and then unrack and hold. This is so important. He is going to settle position prior to starting the unrack. Now, if you unrack it and you're already falling back or forward, this is a very common thing and something you need to actually address. We'll cover that soon here in the common faults. But he's going to settle here, then go through his 3-step walkout. Now, when it comes to the walkout, one quick note I do have is that the ideal walkout for a lifter, there is some individuality to be talked about there. And usually it's between 2 and 4 steps. If you're somebody with a wider stance, you may take that 3-step walkout and need 1 more step to get your width. If you're somebody with a more narrow stance, 2 steps might be ideal, but for the vast majority of people, 3 steps is what we should be looking for. So Connor is going to first step straight back, then step back and lateral, and then 3rd step is going to be getting into his ideal width. Now, you'll notice after each and every step, what did he do? He paused. This is not a rush. We're not trying to see how fast we can go. Instead, it is slow, it is concise, and he is pausing after each step. Now, once he's here, he's going to settle and first make sure he's nice and tall. What a lot of people do is they have a little positional degradation, have a little bit of forward head position, and understand these positional faults do degrade your ability to breathe and brace optimally. So the first thing he does when he gets here, make sure he's tall and stacked. From here, he's going to start to go through his cadence. Now, the first step after making sure he's tall in this cadence is his rooting. A lot of people talk about rooting, but not a lot of people actually cue it or know how to cue it. We simply like a 2-step process to cueing rooting for the squat. The first of which is splaying our toes maximally. The second of which is gripping the floor. But the key part there is gripping, not flexing our toes. We have a cue called the short foot cue that we have a series of videos on how to perform and what it looks like in our education service. But for now, we'll just go ahead and talk about that splay to grip. Now, once he is rooted, once he is tall, the next thing we're going to going to do is we're going to breathe into that already established brace, brace once more, engage his lats, and then finally go through his actual squat. Beautiful. Rack it for me, Connor. Now you'll notice when he racks it, he doesn't do anything silly. He didn't say Kobe and throws it in there. Instead, he walks it in nice and careful. A lot of people also miss that. That's a very common fault, or people stand up and just toss that bad boy back in. In fact, I was recently having a conversation with a very well-known clinician where they talked about how that's the most common cause of injury he sees that no one talks about, is hurting yourself on the re-rack trying to sprint with heavier loads. But those are going to be our main performance points around the setup and the cadence of cues we should use prior to starting the eccentric. Let's run through it one more time. Connor's going to go ahead and first grab the bar, right, left, make sure he's nice and even. He's going to set his feet first, eagle eye view, making sure it's directly centered over that midfoot. Now he's going to go ahead and get under. As he gets under, there's no positional deviation, not extending at the lumbar spine. Now, once he's there, he's going to go ahead and breathe, brace, engage his lats, pack his head, stand tall, take one step back, second back and lateral, third step lateral. He's in his ideal stance width, looking really good. He does one more positional checklist: breathe, brace, engage lats, hinge, and actually squat. Re-rack it for me. Beautiful. So I know a lot of this stuff may seem rudimentary, may seem like you're too good for, but it is unbelievable how many athletes we get to work with where the biggest reason why they are getting injured, the biggest reason why they have massive limitations to their ability to handle load, is that they have no process, no step-by-step cadence, nothing of the sort, and it's extremely detrimental to them. They never get to see or experience or true strength because every setup, every walkout, every squat is a little bit different and it hurts them greatly. Let's transition to common faults, and my goodness, is there so many that we could cover here, but we're going to start with just a few of the most common. And the first thing we need to touch on is setup faults specifically. And again, there is an abundant amount we could touch on, but we're going to narrow that down to 4 of the most common we see, starting off with faults or positional deviations that take place prior to even unracking. Let's go ahead and show that first, Connor. So as he gets under the barbell, you go nice and slow for me. Watch his lumbar spine. Super common for people to extend as they actually get under the barbell. So you'll notice this is massive anterior pelvic tilt. Now, what a lot of people do is they'll either try to unrack from here, or they'll kind of try to fix it by trying to breathe and brace from this position. But once we breathe and brace from a deviated lumbopelvic position, we immediately remove our ability to do so optimally in the first place. Another good example is people getting under it with decent position, pretty good position, but as they're getting ready, as they're shifting, as they're doing things, flexion of the thoracic spine happens more, head position comes forward more, and by the time he unracks, it's an absolute train wreck. Go ahead and re-rack that for me, Connor. Beautifully ugly. I love to see it. Make sure that prior to applying any tension, prior to actually unracking, we go through this positional checklist of making sure that that lumbopelvic region is neutral, stable, head position is neutral. I can draw a straight line from the top of the cervical all the way down to the bottom of the lumbar. Now, the second one we got to cover is going to be foot placement. This is, even in high-level lifters, so common, and it drives me crazy because a lot of people ruin their squat prior to even starting their squat due to foot position issues. So the first one I want to show is his feet being too far forward. So if instead of that bar being lined up in the midfoot, the bar's lined up too far forward, the second he unracks, he's going to be falling backwards. Beautifully ugly. Love to see it. That always happens, so incredibly common. The second of which is his feet are too far back. When his feet are too far back, he's not necessarily going to fall backwards. He's going to more so have a hard time not falling forward, typically overcome it, but fry his lumbar spine in the process. It's almost like a good morning to get the weight out. Now, you may be able to do that with 50%, 60%, even 80%, but once you get to 100% or 90% plus of your 1 rep max and you try to good morning it out and fry your spinal erectors and everything right here prior to squatting, this is a major issue. So we have to put that foot right in the middle. I should be able to see it from the cap of the barbell, a straight line down to the midfoot, and that's how we know we're going to be able to unrack as efficiently as possible. Now, the third one I want to cover is position loss during the actual unrack. And this tends to happen in one very specific way, where people will extend at the knee but achieve no hip extension, no uprightness of the upper body, and because of that, it looks something like this here. Absolute shit show, elbows pitched out, head position comes forward, terrible position to start your walkout from. Go ahead and drop that bad boy down for me. The cue I really like to use, again, the reason why it's happening is because somebody's just extending at the knee. They're not correcting their upper body position. They're not using their posterior chain, specifically their glutes, to actually extend at the hip and stand tall. So because of this, a very simple yet effective way to achieve a better position is thinking about doing two things. One, packing the head, two, squeezing the glutes simultaneously, looking something like this here. And then from here, we can hold prior to starting the walkout. Re-rack it for me, Connor, beautiful. But that cue right there does wonders. But whenever you see somebody deviate like that, again, it's because they're not extending at the hip. So simply cueing them to squeeze the glute, pack the head can be extremely effective. And if that doesn't work, there's some hip extension specific drills we have in our library I'd very much suggest you check out. Now, the last setup fault we're going to cover is the walkout. So stand tall for me here. Don't walk out quite yet. The first one I want to cover is going to be too fast of a walkout. Give me one that's 100 miles an hour, Connor. Beautifully ugly. Love it. Walk back in. This is something we do not want to see. The second of which is going to be walking out too far. It's not a contest. It's not a contest. We're not trying to see how much distance we can clear. Beautiful, re-rack that. We're not trying to see how much distance we can clear. Instead, we are trying to clear just enough distance to not hit the rack, which let me tell you, doesn't take much. Now, the third walkout fault is by far the most common, even in extremely high level lifters. Understand that we only have to clear minimal distance and we want to take as small steps as possible because we have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1,000 pounds on our back actively trying to crush us, and walking it out is not an easy task. If you take too big of steps, it's going to have a higher likelihood of hurting your position, wasting energy, and just throwing things out of whack. So the most common fault we see is Connor's going to unrack it, and his first step is too big, way too big. Even that, to the camera, to the average person, that may not look that big, but I promise you it is. Our steps do not have to be very far at all. So instead, Connor, walk back for me. His steps should be more like this here. Beautiful. That is that money spot, just enough to clear the rack, not waste energy, not throw off his position. So those are the 4 primary setup faults that we see. Now let's transition to common faults within movement fixes. Understand that we should only regress if we absolutely have to. In fact, if we can fix the problem in the movement itself, we always should. And the vast majority of the time, we can. And this consistently gets overlooked. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people, they're saying in their head seems to be, when in doubt, regress it out. And we could not disagree more. So we'll talk about a few really common faults we see that we can actually address or fix in the movement itself, starting off with breathing. So our most important foundations of axial loaded movement is breathing and bracing and rooting, which is why we're going to be focusing on those two the most. Now, specifically with breathing, people have a hard time breathing horizontally. So a quick preface before we get into this, understand that when we take in air, we should see a 360 sheath of inflation and rigidity. We're not just trying to breathe vertically maximally as much as possible. In fact, that's the last thing we want to see. There's more nuanced reasons as to why we don't want to see it I cover in other videos, but just understand that our diaphragm loses its alignment with our pelvic floor when we see massive vertical breathing patterns, but furthermore, we just can't create the same trunk rigidity, which is the most important facet of loaded movement. But also, a lot of people will struggle with specific portions of their trunk inflating and creating rigidity. So first thing we're going to cover is a simple way we can address those in the movement itself. Connor, go ahead and unrack, walk forward for me. I know that's a bit of a shit show. We don't like to show it this way, but just for example's sake, we'll show it like this. Beautiful. Now, first thing Connor's going to do is he's going to give a few examples of the horrendous breathing patterns we see so often. Massive vertical breathing. Not high enough. Give me another. Beautiful. A few more. So when he does this, you'll notice that the anterior portion, that diaphragm moves forward, his chest moves anteriorly, and it really hurts his position. In fact, some people do this so bad, they literally enter lumbar extension as they do it. So this is not something we want to see. And for the most part, we can achieve improvements in the movement itself with tactile cueing. So I'm going to have Connor relax here for a second, and I'm going to give him a nice tactile stimulus, both in the posterior aspect of his trunk, as well as the anterior, more so oblique. I'm going to dig in here pretty deep and have him close his eyes and slowly breathe into my fingers and thumbs. Beautiful. A few more times. Now the camera can't see this, but even my fingers in the back are inflating. He's using the totality of his trunk musculature to achieve an eccentric activation or maximal intra-abdominal pressure, which again, if you don't know what I'm talking about here, many videos in our library where I talk about this in depth and get into the anatomy and more nuance behind it. Beautiful. So a very simple way we can improve those breathing mechanics. Now the second thing I want to get into is ways we can improve rooting in the squat. Now, typically, the most common issue we see is people shifting to their toes and collapsing inward as they squat. Do me a favor, show me an ugly rep like that. Beautiful. Now, you'll notice, stop right here, when he does that, this portion of his foot actually leaves the floor. More specifically, he's going into pronation, which we do not want to see for a variety of different reasons, the biggest of which is it's going to hurt his established connection with the floor and hurt upstream function. More specifically, it's going to cause down regulation. Our brain does not like that in any way, shape, or form. We have this amazing anti-injury mechanism where it refuses to recruit as many muscle fibers or produce as much force when we have rooting issues. So one more time, show me that ugly squat. Beautiful. You'll notice if you look very carefully, his pinky toe is literally leaving the floor. Very, very common. So we can fix this oftentimes in the movement itself with a floss band. Let me go ahead and show you what I'm talking about. Now, what I'm going to do is, since this portion of the foot is leaving the floor, I'm going to put a floss band under that exact point. Beautiful. Trap it down. That's leaving the ground. And I'm going to ask him, force him to not let this snap. I'm going to apply a good amount of tension and have him squat while maintaining that connection. If he slips into pronation again, it snaps away from us. We get an immediate indicator. So that is a really powerful drill to improve that specific facet of his rooting. The last one I want to cover is the ankle stacking drill. So there's a few different reasons why knee cave tends to happen, and we'll get into the specifics of that later on. But one of the more common ways is losing ankle stacking or allowing the ankles to collapse inward. Show that for me here. Go through a squat. Beautiful. So oftentimes it's less of a rooting issue, more of an ankle stacking issue. And an in-movement fix we can do is going to be this here. So we're going to take this band, double it up, and then I'll put this around his feet on each side. Gorgeous. I'm going to make sure this is nice and low on his foot. He's going to get into his normal squat stance. And now, prior to actually showing the squat, Connor, if you can just, there we go, work out against it a few times. So it forces him or produces a tactile stimulus he can work against to stack the ankle and centrate his weight and load over the foot like it should. Now, as he goes to the eccentric, he can stack, maintain that stack as he goes through the entirety of the movement. You'll notice all of a sudden his rooting, his connection with the floor gets a lot better. So those are a few examples of many we could touch on of in-movement fixes for major common faults. And lastly, there are some very common faults that we do have to regress to achieve improvements with. We're going to show a few of those next, probably the most common of which, in fact, one of the most common faults in general that we see out there in the industry is going to be anterior pelvic tilt to start the squat eccentric. And it stems from typically a fundamental issue or limitation to achieve optimal or good, rather, hinge mechanics. A lot of people were taught at a very young age, chest to the ceiling, look up, and cues like this. There's a common saying that no cue is a bad cue, but there's certainly some cues that are wildly inappropriate for the situation, and this is certainly one of them. But due to this, they have a deeply ingrained pattern of thinking that hinging just means keep our upper body as high as possible as our hips kick back and go into massive anterior pelvic tilt. Now, there's a long explanation I could give on why this is not something we want to see. To name just a few reasons, understand that when that anterior pelvic tilt happens, and actually Connor, face that way and show them just a few times, massive anterior pelvic tilt to start the eccentric, just like that. When that happens, a few things take place. You can go relax there, the biggest of which is a change in length tension relationships of primary movers. Hamstrings are lengthened, quads are shortened, all that anterior hip musculature, the psoas and musculature of that nature gets shortened aggressively as well. And due to that, a lot of people have chronic pain, soreness, and general dysfunction in that musculature, as well as a downregulation for those primary movers to generate force optimally. Furthermore, we're under axial load trying to actively crush us, and we're going into massive lumbar extensions. Those are just two reasons amongst many why we don't want to see this. So when we see this, having somebody perform drills that teaches their body how to hinge more effectively is paramount. So Connor's going to go ahead and take this guy here. This is one of our favorite shoulder rock hinge drills. We do prefer, very much prefer at the very least, using a shoulder rock for this. The way it's weighted is perfect. But you'll notice that he has 3 points of contact. 1, the back of his head, 2, the middle of his scapula, and 3, the top of the glutes. He's going to maintain all 3 of those points of contact as he hinges and actually squats. Go ahead and do so for me. And he only has to do about a half range motion, third range of motion kind of squat. Doesn't take much at all. And honestly, he could just practice the hinge too. He could just hinge a few times, since that's the main movement pattern we're struggling with. And by doing so as a prep movement prior to squatting, and then cueing the exact same thing as he squats, hinge issues tend to go away in a very efficient manner. Awesome. You can go and let that down there, Connor. Beautiful. The second one we're going to cover is going to be breathing issues with a regression. So understand that breathing issues can get very nuanced, and oftentimes when somebody has these deeply ingrained limitations around their breathing pattern, it's not just taking place in training. It's taking place in every single facet of their life, which is why when somebody has these, I encourage them, when you're playing video games, when you're driving your car, when you're eating your dinner, when you're at work, take systematic breaks throughout the day to practice your breathing pattern, because realistically improving, changing from this vertical stress adapted breathing pattern to a horizontal breathing pattern have benefits, or has benefits that far surpass just training alone. But my goodness, they benefit training as well. And a really simple example of a drill that you can do this with is the sandwich drill. So what Connor's going to do is he's going to take his thumbs and poke it in the posterior aspect of his trunk, right under his last rib. And he's going to take his fingers, poke it in the anterior, more so the obliques, and he's going to dig it in deep. He is not going to be nice about it. It should cause some discomfort. And from here, he can practice his breathing patterns. I really like to have people close their eyes and really think about breathing into both the fingers and the thumbs, because keep in mind we should have that 360 inflation even taking place back here. So he can breathe several times, really helping to cue that and achieve a different default breathing pattern. Or he can even practice his bracing, his muscular co-contraction from here as well. So you can relax completely and just fire. There we go. We can just fire that trunk musculature and brace musculature specifically. And then lastly, he can even put that together, and he can brace, breathe, brace, go through the whole gambit of it, and constantly have that awesome tactile cue to do it better and to reinforce the most ideal breathing and bracing patterns possible. Now, last one we're going to cover is the dead bug. Now, the dead bug is one of our absolute favorite exercises you can do, and it's very versatile. You can use it to potentiate performance prior to axial loading, or any kind of performance rather, but you can also do it as an actual high quality adaptable training stimulus depending upon the intensity, the loading, that kind of stuff that you use with it. We're going to show specifically how we like to perform it, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about this movement. And understand, just like many other exercises out there, if you do it incorrect, you get practically nothing out of it. Now, it's not like a bicep curl. If you do bicep curls and you start throwing your hips into it or something like that, may not be the best best stimulation in the world, but you still get some high quality stimulation. You still achieve the end goal to an extent, maybe not optimally though. When it comes to this guy here, by deviating position, by extending the lumbar spine, which is so common, we not only don't get the stimulation we're looking for, we may even cause more harm than good, because the main purpose of this movement, especially being used prior to axial loading to potentiate performance, is to teach our body how to create and maintain a neutral position with maximal trunk stability. So if instead of potentiating neutrality, we do the exact opposite and go into extension, we could do more harm than good. So it's vitally important we do this with the utmost intent and really paying attention to mechanics, especially in that lumbopelvic area. So Connor's going to go ahead and get into his start position here. Beautiful. Now, notice a few things. 1, knees are slightly above waistline. 2, his feet are looking like this. They're not too far out, not too far in. His hands are directly above his shoulder. His head is packed onto the ground. He's not crunching up or anything of that nature. Now, from here, just holding this position requires some trunk stability, right? So he's not having to hold his breath and create maximal intra-abdominal pressure. He's just creating a simple muscular co-contraction to maintain this neutral position while holding his limbs in this position. So from here, he has to not only maintain that, but breathe through it. So believe it or not, even this alone can be a very powerful tool to teach the body how to delineate muscular co-contraction while still breathing within a high quality horizontal breathing pattern. And he can even give himself a tactile cue, let's say in his anterior oblique, to breathe into to make sure he's still achieving ideal breathing mechanics. Again, as far as potentiation of this here goes, this is incredibly powerful. Now, he can also increase the intensity by returning to this position and starting to extend his limbs. We can do something very simple to start and just go arm. We can just go arm. It doesn't have to be a lot. Even that increases the intensity. Is a lot harder than it actually looks. We can also go just a leg. Do 1 rep with just a leg for me, and you'll notice as he's doing this, it's nice and slow. There's no reason to go fast. In fact, the faster you go, the more limited the ability or the benefit is that you get from it. Now, the most important, or the most, our favorite rather, way to do this is the contralateral version. So he's going to extend his arm and leg nice and slow, trying to be as synchronized as possible, though let me tell you, a lot harder than it looks, takes some serious coordination. And now he's going to slowly come up, and I am not exaggerating when I say it should take a minimal of 6 seconds to go from end range to end range. To complete 1 rep, it should take 6 seconds. This is the kind of tempo we need to use to extract all the benefit from it. And let me tell you, the IP, the trunk stability demands are quite high. Now, lastly, this is something that's really important. This device right here is one of the most high quality, high tech devices you can possibly have in your gym. It is a simple backpack strap, and my goodness, is it beautiful for this, because here's the thing. Connor, if he slips into extension as he does this, how's that feel? Is that hard? Is it easy?
It's pretty easy.
Yeah.
Fall there.
Exactly. He can do that all day. You slip into extension and start extending limbs, I mean, you can crank that out. It's incredibly easy because you took the trunk stability to maintain that position out of the equation. So let's make sure that not a semblance of extension takes place, because that was exaggerated so you can see it, but sometimes it happens so small it's impossible to see with the naked eye. This provides you the awareness, the feedback, the testing required to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, you can have a partner do this, or you can do it yourself. I want to show the self version, as most of you won't always have a partner to do this with. So Connor's going to sit up for just a second. Actually, sit up completely. I'm going to put this under his back. Now, when I put it under his back, again, we're going for right under that last rib. So somewhere right in here, he's going to sit on back for me. Now from here, he's going to go ahead and grab, let's grab the end close to the camera. He's going to grab one end, get into position. Now from here, he is going to have a very high demand of using these posterior stabilizers to maintain not only neutrality, but to maintain this band, or sorry, this backpack strap as he's pulling on it. Now, be honest and push yourself when you go to do this. He can easily just kind of hold on to it and not do shit, but instead he wants to pull on it quite hard. Now from here, he can do that same contralateral dead bug as he's yanking on this strap, and he has to be perfect. If a semblance of extension happens, go ahead and show it. He can pull that strap right out from under him. The only thing maintaining it is going to be maximal utilization of those posterior stabilizers, getting the best potentiation effect possible. Now, last thing I want to note on this is if we're using this to potentiate performance, if we're using this to improve his awareness, his ability to stabilize that trunk to avoid pelvic deviations and other issues, other common faults associated with this, then we don't want the intensity to be too high. We want the duration, we want the repetitions to be nice and low. It should be hard, but at the same time, we're not adding load. Understand that if we're using this movement, very versatile movement, if we're using it to potentiate, no load, just focusing on the best stimulation, best awareness benefits possible, and low duration, low intensity. We're not trying to push ourselves too much, because if we push ourselves too much, it could actually burn you out prior to needing your trunk stabilizers the most before we go to squat and deadlift. So this potentiation, we add some load to it, we increase repetitions, increase sets, then we start working towards more so an adaptable stimulus, and that takes place in general after our heavier loaded movements. Let's transition to warming up, or what we like to call movement prep. I don't typically love the verbiage of warming up, because what oftentimes people associate it with is just hopping on a bike, doing some random blood flow exercises, trying to get the heart rate up, which, don't get me wrong, isn't inherently wrong, but does that prepare you to handle load in the most optimal way possible? I would argue no. In fact, our warm-up should be ready to change on the day and change depending upon a person's needs to help potentiate performance as much as possible. Now, most people tend to bias towards warm-ups that are very non-specific and far too long. For most people, their movement prep should be in this general range of 5 to 10 minutes, though there's plenty of reasons or plenty of examples of when somebody would have to surpass that or even go a little bit under that. For example, some of the best athletes we've ever worked with, including Chris Duffin during his biggest strength feats when he was injured, dealing with extra fatigue, trying to squat 1,000 pounds for reps, he did warm-ups that were far longer than 10 minutes, right? But there's also some people, especially newer lifters, that might not really need to do any warm-up or movement prep in the first place. They can do a few extra warm-up sets on the barbell and be just fine, perform extremely well. And also, some people will start with a squat to assess how their body's feeling that day, which is also can be a really good idea. But the main point I'm making here is your warm-up should be tailored to you, your needs, and what you need to do to potentiate performance as much as possible, but furthermore, ready to change on the day. Oftentimes we get asked, what's the best squat warm-up? What's the best deadlift warm-up? And again, it's an inherently flawed question. There is none. There's only what's the best for you or what's more optimal for you. So I want to cover a few case study-like examples of common faults we see and some of the warm-up movements we'd add in to address it and help correct it. Now, usually what I suggest people do is have a baseline movement drills. So for example, with me, my baseline movement drills are shin box get up, some dead bugs, and a KB pass, Bulgarian split squat, something that challenges rooting. That's typically what I perform as my baseline. And if you think about those very carefully, those are addressing the major movement components of the squat. Then once you get done with your baseline, you can get on the barbell, see how the body feels, see how you're performing, look at yourself on camera, and see if we need to add anything in. So let's cover some examples of movement faults where we can add to our warm-up, throw something additional in to help overcome movement faults or any feelings of not performing as well as you otherwise could. Now, Connor's going to go ahead and get under the barbell here, and the first thing we're going to cover is shoulder mobility issues. This happens all the time where somebody may have benched heavy with a high intensity the day before. They go to get under the barbell and their pecs, their lats, all this tissue is in this hypertonic state. It's not performing well. It's limiting his mobility. It usually looks something like this here. Elbows pitched out, usually a searing anterior delt pain, a little bit of medial elbow pain, all kinds of things happening that's not favorable. And in this position, he is never going to be able to handle load optimally. So from here, you're going to drop that barbell, walk on out. No point of even executing any squats. He needs to address his shoulder mobility limitations within external rotation and flexion. This is a fantastic drill he can add into his warm-ups to address that. So Connor, what I'm going to have you do is face this. Yeah, beautiful actually. Great job showing the setup. I often forget that, but we're using 2 bands here, very light bands. This drill kind of sucks, I'm not gonna lie. I almost feel bad putting Connor through this, to be honest. But Connor's gonna get to the start position. Beautiful. Now you'll notice I'm going to have him separate his arms a little more. Beautiful. And what he's focusing on is actively retracting with a straight arm position. Now from here, he's going to brace and he's going to go through about a 3rd range of motion squat. Doesn't have to be anything too severe, trying to stay nice and upright. Beautiful. Now every time he gets to the top, he pulls back on those bands again. He reinforces position. Do a few more reps for me. Nice and upright, and then reinforce. Beautiful. One more time. And reinforce, beautiful, and then drop it down. Beautiful. So simple as 1 set of 10 to 12 reps, that alone can have massive effects on your ability to get to a better squat position. But that's one example of something we can add into our warm-up to adapt to our body's needs that day to improve your ability to handle load and do so as safely as possible. Next common fault we're going to go over is posterior pelvic tilt. This is extraordinarily common and it's a very nuanced subject. In fact, we have large lecture pieces we go into this in depth in other formats or other pieces of content, but this specifically is not always an inherently bad thing. If it happens to a very small extent, it can be perfectly fine. In fact, it can be a part of someone's natural hip morphology and what needs to happen for them to achieve a deeper range of motion squat. But for the most part, especially when it happens to a very severe degree, it is something that indicates a problem. It is something that we should work to correcting. And oftentimes, it can happen for a few different reasons, but oftentimes it happens due to limited engagement usage of those posterior stabilizers. This happens all the time where somebody is very heavy in the front, very heavy in the anterior. They breathe here, they brace here, but you go to poke into the posterior, nothing's happening. Absolutely nothing's happening. They lack activity back there, and due to this, they lack control of that pelvis and often go into posterior pelvic tilt at the bottom of the squat, which looks something like this here. So Connor, go ahead and show them nice and slow. Beautiful. Stand up tall. Do one more rep for me, nice and slow. You'll notice that pelvis is dumping massively at the bottom there. And Connor is definitely somebody that doesn't need to do that by any means. So with that being said, we've identified the reason it's happening is due to a lack of engagement in those posterior stabilizers. So we're going to add to his warm-up the banded Sphinx drill. I love this drill. Head over heels for it. There's a few different ways that we can actually perform it, but my favorite way is the one that Connor is setting up right now. So understand that it's traditionally actually performed on the ground like this here, hands and knees, but this variation I like more. And if I could not have my knees on the hard ground, I prefer it. So Connor's going to go ahead and get in a position here. You'll notice his hands, gorgeous, just like that. And he's going to put that band right under, you guessed it, that last rib. He's going to grab the barbell about shoulder width distance. And let's narrow that grip just a little bit, about shoulder width there, beautiful. And what he's actually gonna do is he's actually gonna push into the barbell a little bit, almost like he's trying to protract slightly at the shoulder girdle. Beautiful. Now there's a ton of tension right here, and he has to work really hard, have this beautiful tactile stimulus to brace against. Beautiful. Now, just like the sandwich breathing drill, I typically like to do it in 3 different phases. Braces only, breaths only, and then brace, breathe, brace, the total gambit of our ability to create trunk rigidity, and that way we can practice each and every facet of it with this tactile stimulus. So let's go ahead and not breathe at all and just brace for me here. Beautiful, relax, a few more times. Beautiful, and we're not expecting a lot. There's just a little bit of this band going outward. We're making sure though that he's not deviating position, definitely not flexing, not pushing his ass out against it, nothing like that. Instead, it's only happening here. Now, once he's done with his braces, he can start to just breathe into that band nice and slow. The keyword there is slow. I really like to go with like a 4 to 5 second inhale, 1 to 2 second hold, 4 to 5 second exhale, and repeat. But he's just closing his eyes and focusing on breathing into that band nice and slow. Now, once he gets done with that, we can finally put it all together, breathe, brace, set our trunk stability like we're about to enter the eccentric of a very heavy squat. So he's going to go ahead and brace, breathe into that brace, and brace once more, creating as much stability as possible while receiving that beautiful tactile stimulus. Now, once he goes to squat again, he's going to have better pelvic control, mitigating the likelihood of having that massive posterior pelvic tilt at the bottom. Next example is tightness of the hip, and oftentimes people feel this the second they get under the barbell and start actually squatting. Connor here gets under the barbell, pretend barbell in this scenario, and as he's squatting, he just feels so much tightness, especially in that anterior portion of the hip. Maybe he's having a little bit of collapsing in the knees, just feel like he can't externally rotate very well. If that's the case, let's add in some hip mobilization and or stability work with one of our favorites, the hip airplane. So what we're going to do is we're going to have Connor slowly, and we'll actually turn you about this way actually for me. Beautiful. What we're going to have you do is slowly, like you're wiping poop off your shoes, skid that foot back, keep toe contact at end range. You'll notice that from his head to his heel, it is a relatively straight line, about a 45-degree angle. Now from here, he is going to brace and push the mobility of his hip and stability of the hip as he slowly externally rotates, internally rotates, and then does several repetitions from here. As he's doing so, he's making sure that this straight line from shoulder, greater trochanter of hip and ankle is perfectly straight. He's not getting any misalignment there, and he's going incredibly slow, also challenging his rooting capabilities as well. In fact, that's one of the biggest reasons why you can relax your Connor. It's one of the biggest reasons why we love this drill, is it integrates just about every major facet and requirement for the squat as far as hip stability, hip mobility, rooting ability, the motor control to go through this movement without suffering positional deviations. It is so much more challenging than people give it credit for. But one important caveat, if you do it, film yourself doing it, because I promise you, you're gonna have at least one issue while doing it to where if you don't see it on camera, you will not see it at all. Again, major common ones there is getting that upper body to lead the movement, losing this connection here, losing your brace, pushing end range a little bit too much. Things of this nature really limit the effectiveness or what you get out of it, so just make sure you get it on film. Now we're kind of skimming through this very quickly, but understand that in our movement library, we have entire videos dedicated to movements like this that get incredibly in-depth, talk about every single major fault and facet of the exercise itself. So for more info on it, go ahead and check those out. And the last common fault example for warm-ups here is going to be knee cave. Now knee cave, Connor, go ahead and show what I'm talking about here. Knee cave is kind of a nuanced subject, In fact, we have entire large lectures in our library dedicated to this topic in particular because it has a lot more nuance than people give it credit for. When it comes to knee cave, the reason why it happens is not because the knees are running amok doing their own thing. In fact, they don't even think for themselves. There are two references I really like to use to describe the relationship between your knee, your ankle rooting complex, and your hip. Those two are, one, your knee is a conduit of communication between your foot-ankle complex and the hip. That's a really good way of describing it. It does what these two things tell it to do. It does not think for itself. The second reference that really paints the picture well is the knee is a private in a stereotypical military movie. The private does not think for himself, does not do for himself. The private only does what his commanders tell him to do. And the commanders in this situation is the foot-ankle complex and the hip. The knee is the private, and the knee only does what these two segments of our body tells it to do. So with that being said, when somebody has knee cave issues, a lot of people throw that band around the knees and just aimlessly rotate out, rotate out, rotate out. And what happens the second they push load or intensity at all, they go right back to that massive knee cave. If it's a technical reason why it's happening, which usually is the case, again, it's one of two things, foot, ankle, or hip. Most commonly, it's going to be the foot ankle. So if we see that happening in the movement, we've already showed the banded ankle stack can be fantastic. The band X rooting drill, also those floss band drills can be rather effective as well in the movement itself, but also relating to the hip, sometimes, in fact, one of the most common reasons if it's happening at the hip is because somebody has poor trunk stability or poor hinge mechanics, goes into massive anterior pelvic tilt, and when that happens, they lose motor control of downstream structures, including the actual knee. So understand that when we see movement faults like this, we first need to identify why it's happening, what the lacking component within movement is, and then add in some warm-up drills to help address it and potentiate performance, because that's what warming up is all about, or what we like to call movement drills, movement prep rather, is all about, is trying to potentiate a performance and movement quality and safety under load as much as possible, not just aimlessly hopping on a elliptical, a bike, and just getting that blood flow up.